Welcome to the Lifetime Real Estate Advisors podcast, where we believe homeownership should be central and early to your financial planning process. Today, we're going to talk about a Wall Street Journal article that came out on
22nd.
the 22nd of December. So, about a week ago. And it's basically saying once again that renting is a better idea. The rise of forever renters is the title of the article, and how people are living so well by choosing to rent instead of owning. Anyway, we're going to analyze that really fun article, and talk about why we think they're wrong. Okay. So what do you think, Brady? You were the one that saw this article first, and I think your analysis of it, you posted it on Facebook in our Lifetime Real Estate Advisors Facebook group, and I thought it was mind-blowing to say the least, that you break down the cost of renting and owning in their situations that they're giving you, and you basically tear them apart, and there are millions and millions of dollars of difference in just owning your own home versus renting it, right?
Yeah, and then
Where
what
do you want to
that
start
what
with this, Brady?
well first the thing that I think of first when I read that article is it sounds like it's reporting something like, hey, there's a lot of people that are choosing to rent the rest of their lives. And I want to point out that that's not unethical. You don't have to own a home. You're not a bad person if you don't own a home. What really bothered me about that article is it sounded like they were just reporting that this statistic is happening, but they really sell it in the article. They sell it as, oh, it's a good idea. And they have several examples where people are talking about, yeah, this is what I've decided to do because it's better for my lifestyle. They quote somebody in there saying something like, it's a really good deal for what I get. And it's inexpensive for the lifestyle that I get on a monthly basis. And what is he said something to the effect of, it's a really good deal to get what I want. And I think to myself, like, well, maybe you need to rethink what you want. And maybe that's not my place to say for everybody, but the problem that they're not encompassing with that article properly is they're straw manning the other side of it, right? They're not talking about the financial benefit of home ownership. They're just talking about the monthly expense, today's monthly expense for what roof you have over your head, whether there's pillars of marble or whether it's a shack, right? They're just talking about how nice can I live today for the amount of dollars that I'm spending just this month to stay dry when it rains, right?
Yeah,
So go ahead.
yeah, that's true. It's so many people are locked into month to month, and honestly, it's hard to blame them because it's tough right now out there. The economy is suffering in different ways. We don't call it a recession. If you just look at stock market prices, the economy looks great, right? Unemployment is still low too, and but at the same time, that doesn't always trickle down to the common person who's stuck renting and maybe thinking about owning a home and trying to make that decision. So it's really pertinent to kind of break past that barrier of getting people to think long term instead of month to month, which is so common. So how do we talk about that?
Yeah, and it's like we live in an age, and I know you have children, I have children. It's one of the things that I'm constantly thinking about with my children is how do I teach them to make proper sacrifices today for a better future tomorrow? It's almost like every lesson that I want my children to learn, and it's not like I've learned all the lessons either. So I've made plenty of mistakes, right? But everything that I try to bestow upon my kids as far as like knowledge that will help them throughout their lives, if you drill down to the very kernel, the very essence of what it is that I'm trying to help them with, whether it's, eating your vegetables or something as complex as saving money and preparing for the future, it the kernel of that is always delayed gratification, some version of it, and balancing that out because it's not right to delay all gratification, right? You have to value the present moment as well to some degree. But we've gotten to this scenario in culture now where we're so focused on what's the best I can get today with the smallest sacrifice I can make today. And if that's the only thing that you're interested in, rent does make sense. I can live in a nicer home for the next 30 days for less money by giving the landlord some money rather than paying, to buy a home. The problem is, though, even over a short period of time, we could talk about what happens over 30 or 40 years, and we're talking about millions of dollars of difference between those two paths. But even within 5 or 6 years, you're talking about six-figure differences in the trajectory of your wealth between where the money is going and who's building wealth upon that monthly cycle of paying, whether you're paying the landlord or the lender, right? One of them is building up your own wealth, and one of them is building up the wealth of somebody else. Um, and the Wall Street Journal just doesn't touch on that at all, which is a shame, right? We're not talking about the New York Times, which is not necessarily finance related, they're going to have a financial section. But the Wall Street Journal is the financial journal of the country, and they're only talking about how the rise of these these developments in America. There are developments being built now specifically owned by investors. They're not even for sale to individuals. The development, the whole development itself, these are single family homes in a whole neighborhood being built just to rent. Now, the fact that there's a market for that is not, I'm not making an ethical claim about that. If you want to rent the rest of your life, go for it. I just want people to do that with their eyes wide open. For example, people will say often, well, if I want to live in a place where there's younger people, where there's a pool and places to congregate, and I like that kind of lifestyle, go for it. And people will say something about that. They'll say, well, you can't put a price on that. And I want to say, well, yes, you can. You can definitely put a price on that. And I intend to do that. We can do that. We know the numbers. And I'm not saying that if once you know the price, then you'll obviously want to go buy a home. That's not going to be true for everybody. But once you know the price, you really should know what that's costing you, because it literally is a seven-figure thing that you're spending in order to have that lifestyle in it. Because the cost of renting, so they use an example in that article of something that costs $3,000 a month to rent. Now, if rent goes up by 3.5% for the next 35 years, and think about this, like 35 years is not too long to be thinking about. Most of us have more than 35 years to, because you don't plan your finances out to retirement. That's a common instinct that we have to think that, well, I need to plan my finances till I retire. But really, you're planning your finances out the rest of your life, right? So you should be planning your finances out till age 100 or something like that, just to be safe in case you live longer than you might expect to. So 35 years is not too long to be thinking about. But if you plan to rent the rest of your life and you're looking at an apartment in some cool area downtown somewhere, or a house somewhere that's costing $3,000 a month, and again, depending on your market, that might be a lot or a little, but it's the shape and it's the differences that matter here. So if you're thinking of renting something that costs $3,000 a month now, rent is going to increase by about 3.5% per year. It has for a very long time. I see no signs of that stopping. In fact, I think if I were going to bet on the over under of 3.5%, I would bet on the over, right? I wouldn't bet on the under. Like when inflation is too low, Congress likes that. That gives them the ability to turn things up and still be safe in the public opinion, because they don't want it to be lower than 3.5%. That hurts them financially, the people that control that. So if I had to bet on over or under 3.5%, I'd bet on over. But if we just use 3.5%, a $3,000 per month rent is going to cost $10,000 a month and some change 35 years from now. And that's not an intuitive thing for people to think about, but it happened before. Like 35 years ago, could you rent something that rents now for $3,000 a month? Could you rent it for $1,000 a month or $900 a month 35 years ago? Absolutely. And
Right. That's about.
yeah. So 35 years from now, you're gonna need to plan for $10,000 a month expense on rent, which is like, again, if you're planning on it and you want to make that work, go for it. It's not unethical to do that. However, if it's two things to think about. Another one is, or one of them is, if it's 4.5%. So if it's just a percent higher, instead of 3.5%, rent increases by 4.5%. That number will be $14,000 a month. And anybody with a financial
Per
mind,
month.
yeah, that's a
Per month.
huge,
That's
huge
that's
number.
huge.
And remember, these are after-tax dollars, so you can't earn $14,000 a month and then give it to your landlord. You have to earn, $20,000 a month in order to give $14,000 to your landlord. And anybody with a financial background or with some acumen in finance is going to listen and think, well, yeah, but it's not the same $14,000 a month then as it is now. And it's like, well, that's true. That's absolutely true. However, if you could lock that in so that that expense for you is only $3,000 a month then, or $2,000 a month then, or $1,500 because you've paid off the mortgage and now you're just paying tax and insurance along the way, that's a huge, huge influx of spendable cash in your budget, or a huge, a huge, a huge subtraction of your expenses, right? So think about it. If you're trying to live off your investments someday, you're going to need to save enough investments to pay rent also, on top of all the other things that you need, food and transportation and fuel and stuff like that. If you want to add on top of that an extra, so let's say if rent costs $10,000 a month from now, and by the time you have your home paid off 35 years from now, you're only spending $1,000 or $1,500 a month on tax and insurance and things like that, and repairs occasionally. Let's call that difference $9,000. You have to save up an extra amount of investments to provide that difference, that $9,000 difference every month, so that you can continue to rent. Do you know how much money it takes to save, to give yourself $9,000 a month extra on top of all the other things you'll need? It's massive.
2.7 million ish. It's inching
Yeah,
up on 3 million, right? Goodness.
yeah. So if you use the 4% rule, which is a common rule in the financial planning industry. Some think you can go higher, some think you can go lower, but that's kind of the standard where people will vary around. But if you use the 4% rule, and for those of you listening that don't know what that is, that means that you can safely draw 4% of your asset base in retirement to keep that asset base healthy so that you can make increases to your cost of living or for inflation for yourself. That's a safe number to distribute from your asset base. If you want to think of that another way, you can think of for every $1,000 a month I want in income, which is $12,000 a year, that equals 4% of $300,000. So for every $1,000 a month I want in income, I need $300,000 in savings. So if I own my house and have it paid off by retirement, and that saves me $9,000 a month because I'm not a forever renter, that's $2.7 million of savings that I don't have to save because my expenses are $9,000 a month less. So when
Big
people
time.
talk about, hey, this is a good value for what I'm getting, I'm like, you're not thinking that through. You need to save an extra $2.7 million in order to have that lifestyle that you say is a good deal. It's not a good deal. Do you think the people owning that real estate and renting it out to the forever renters are bad investors? Like, do you really think they're not thinking that through? They are.
Yeah, they wouldn't set that rent to lose money, right? And they understand the power of leveraged real estate in particular. It's very powerful, as we know.
Yeah,
And one thing I want to mention as we're talking about future projections, something like 35 years in the future, like, oh, how much is a dollar worth today versus dollar 35 years? That's something that absolutely should be thought about, right? And if we keep that 3.5% inflation, that dollar in 35 years is worth 30 cents today. So $100,000 in savings in a year, which is very realistic when you own your home versus renting it out, right? We've done the CE class on renting versus owning, and talked about those projections and how to back up those numbers. But $100,000 in savings per year, that's $30,000 in today's money, which for most people is a very significant sum.
sure. And you know what's funny is we're just talking about monthly expense. So you might even hear this conversation and think, well, I'll just have to save an extra 2.7 million because I really want to be a forever renter. It's like, fine. But if you actually save that extra $2.7 million in addition to owning your home, then you get an extra $9,000 a month of income. Like, how could that? So we like people get into this mentality I've found where they'll think, I want to rent because it keeps me more free. It gives me more options. And I'm thinking like, in what world does having less money give you more options? That just doesn't really connect for me. Right. For the people who want to go backpack through Europe or who want to go travel through South America for a month, who's more likely to enjoy all the bounteous things this world has to offer? Is it people who don't have money or people who do? Right. And I'm not saying that everybody needs to go out there and become a multi-billionaire. That might not be in the cards. There's a lot of teachers and cops and firemen and things like that. They're like something else drove them to do those careers. Something they had a passion to do something that wasn't about becoming a billionaire. Right. There are plenty of people that are motivated strictly by money, and there's nothing, I don't think, wrong with that as long as you're doing it ethically. But there's a lot of people that just aren't motivated by that. They just want to live a good life. And in which case, like in what scenario is that better life possible? Right? Is it somebody who has less money to spend or more money to spend? Somebody who isn't like constantly being crushed by financial pressure, or somebody who's learned how to take that pressure off their shoulder over a few decades, so that by the time that they're getting tired and they want to think about retirement or just work for the pleasure of working, they've got funds to do that with. Like money, I say this a lot, but money's like oxygen. A lot of times, money, we live in a culture that it was based on religious traditions, and the Bible's a pretty influential book. You may have heard of it. Where we get this idea that, well, Paul specifically said, the love of money is the root of all evil, and we sort of interpret that as to like money is evil. He didn't say money is evil, by the way. He said the love of money, which I kind of agree with. If you love money itself, that might be a problem. But you can't ignore it. You can't opt out of that game. You have to have a certain level of financial discipline and acumen in order to not suffocate because we need money. So
Yeah,
I'm just
I've heard over and over the phrase that money isn't everything, but it's right up there with oxygen, right? And I
yeah,
find it interesting too when I do want to play devil's advocate here because buying in 2023, we're at the tail end here on the 29th of December. Buying in 2023 is a little more difficult than it was 2 or 3 years ago, right? And affordability is at it's lower. Interest rates have trickled down in the last month or two, of course, which has been kind of nice. But with the inventory problems where they are right now too, that's probably going to signal an increase in prices. But I do want to talk about affordability, and we're saying things like it's easy to own a home. It's not, right? And you brought up the idea and the principle really of delayed gratification, which is super relevant when you're owning real estate, when you're owning the place where you live, because yes, month to month it does cost more in most cities and towns to own where you're living rather than to rent it. And so I did want to talk about affordability and how that comes into play. And despite market conditions, when interest rates, even when they got up into 8%, it's still because of the ideas and the principles we're talking about, and saving money via equity in your real estate in your own personal residence. It's very relevant. It's still a great idea to do so, even when market conditions were, when Chicken Little was screaming that the sky is falling, right? So let's talk about affordability a little bit and how that affects conditions today versus conditions tomorrow, and people that who are saying, you know what, I want to wait until it gets easier. I want to wait until affordability gets better. What do you have to say about that, Brady?
I That's a great question. And what I think people are expecting people in the industry to say, so like realtors and lenders, they're expecting them to say, something to the effect of, well, rates are going to do this, or let's do this, let's make this plan, here's what's going to happen. I'm a big fan of saying, I don't know what the hell's going to happen. Right? I don't know what's going to happen. And anybody who tries to convince me that they know, I immediately discount them. Do I think interest rates will probably drop? Like if I had to bet on that, I would say interest rates would drop in the spring and the summer of this year. But could terrorists attack some city that we're not prepared for? Could China invade Taiwan? Could something go wrong in Russia and Ukraine that causes everything to change? Sure. I'm
And we have a
I'm
pandemic, right?
Yeah. And even though like COVID was a relatively light pandemic as far as pandemics go, and we totally botched it, right? As a species, we totally botched it. We could not get on the same page. It was a nightmare. And it wrecked the supply chain. It created all sorts of tragic inflation problems. We botched it. And it was
Yeah, we're
relatively
still feeling
easy.
it.
Yeah.
We're still feeling
So
that.
I don't know what's going to happen. Here's what I can say. We've talked about this before. I don't know if we did it on a podcast, but I know we've had this conversation. But like affordability itself, most most markets that we deal with, like when we learn about economics in high school or college or whatever, we learn that what people are willing to supply things for and what people are willing to pay for things, where those numbers cross, that's the price of that good or service. And that's true about apples, it's true about bananas, and it's true about, plumbing services and things like it's true about most things in the economy. One level of complexity that real estate adds to that is because real estate is so often purchased with debt, the price that people are paying for a home isn't usually computed in terms of the price of the house itself. It's usually computed in terms of the monthly cost of the home. That's how people go shopping for homes. And that's the part that is one level of abstraction removed from buying apples at the grocery store, because apples aren't usually purchased with debt. So if you think about a home, let's say a home that's going to cost you $3,500 a month, depending on the market. I mean, it doesn't matter what that number is, but let's just pick a fixed number. We'll call it 3,500. I think of that like a fulcrum. That's the piece that is being affected by inflation. That is creeping up. As inflation gets out of control, that will go up faster than normal. When inflation gets under control, that will go up more slowly, but it's subject to inflation. It will constantly increase. So if I want that $3,500 a month home, if I'm waiting for that to cost me $3,000 a month, that isn't going to happen. In my mind, I'm thinking, well, if interest rates drop enough so that that home that I want is going to cost me $3,000 a month instead of $3,500, if interest rates drop enough for that to actually happen, the price of the home is going to increase, because what people can afford to pay for that home is calculated in their mind in terms of the price per month. So what will happen, that's the fulcrum. And then on the other end, on either end of that fulcrum are the rates and the value of the home itself. So if rates drop enough so that I could actually borrow, if what I needed to borrow to get that home would cost me $3,500 a month, if rates drop so that that amount would only cost me $3,000 a month, the price of the home is going to increase so that the amount of money I have to borrow in order to buy that house is still going to cost me $3,500 a month, just at a lower interest rate. I'm just borrowing more money.
Yeah.
That's actually worse. So if I were to ask you, would you rather borrow more money at a lower interest rate or less money at a higher interest rate, especially in a market where refinancing is a very real possibility? you'd rather borrow less money at a higher rate, because then when you refinance, you still have that lower amount of money that's been borrowed and you get to lower your rate. If you borrowed a lot of money at a lower rate, you have less of an, if you do get to refinance, that will be great, but it's less likely. And B, you're still borrowing that larger amount of money. If I borrow less money at a higher rate and rates drop, I get to refinance that smaller amount of money that I borrowed at the lower rate. So if I ever want that house to cost me $3,000 a month, then the only way for that to really happen is to bite on that opportunity. Bite's the wrong metaphor. Seize that opportunity. Bite means I'm a fish getting caught. Seize that opportunity. Get it, just get into the market today. Get into the real estate ownership cycle rather than the renting cycle that's giving all of your money to the people who really know what's happening with money. They're the ones owning the real estate. Get into that cycle of ownership. And then if rates drop, you may very well be able to pay $3,000 a month for that home. But you'll never be able to get that $3,000 a month by waiting to purchase, because by the time rates drop, you'll have to borrow more money to get that. So the
There's
only
another
the only
element to this.
say
You're
again.
right. You're absolutely right. There's another element to this, though, that we haven't really considered, and that all of that is true in a low inventory market, or at least where inventory is holding steady. And that's where we find ourselves in 2023. Inventory, I mean, the only way that it gets easier without buying first in this market is if inventory skyrockets, right? If there's a significant amount of inventory that outpaces the demand, that's the only way that happens. However, COVID has still backed that up, right? The supply, the cost of the building supplies, the cost to build a house is higher than ever. And that's not ignored by builders. Obviously, they're not going to build a house when they're not going to make a profit. They're not charities, right? Some are, and bless those charities by all means that they're providing a need. But for the vast majority of the market, 99% plus, it's driven by market forces, and the contractors have to make their profits, and they're not going to do that when their supply cost is so high. They have to sell it for a higher amount too. So uh, until inventory eases, this principle is going to be true, and we don't know what inventory is going to do exactly. There's some indications that builders are stepping it up because profit margins are starting to get back to normal with building supplies dropping. But that's the other side of that equation, and we don't see that. That typically happens very slowly. That happened very quickly in 2008 with the big crash, but conditions are vastly different from 2008 right now, right? Because one of the big reasons for that crash, as anybody who's been in the industry for even a short amount of time knows, is loans were, you could get a loan on a song. Walk into a bank and say, you know what, I want to buy this $500,000 house, and they're going to ask, okay, well, how much money do you make? $20,000 a month. Oh yeah, pinky promise, I swear. And then, okay, here you go, here's your mortgage.
Yeah, it was
It's a little bit
ridiculous.
different now. They've really tightened the guidelines to where that's really hard to do. And those subprime mortgages and Dodd-Frank came out and they smacked down a whole bunch of things, right? And some RESPA guidelines came out, and a whole bunch of mortgage regulation made it a lot harder to get money to get loans for mortgages. So we're not going to see a crash in the sense like 2008. And that generated inventory because people were mailing their keys in. So a lot of foreclosures were generating a lot of that inventory, which drove prices down. But those market conditions that we saw then are so different than what we see today. So
Well, and what
that's
people don't
the
realize about inventory, and you kind of mentioned this, we don't know what will happen, but I can definitely tell you certain things that won't happen. Like, inventory is very low today. It will not be very high tomorrow. That is impossible, because houses aren't made in a factory where they can just turn up a knob and produce more houses, right? It takes a long time. Even manufactured homes take a long time to build, because you can even build the structure itself, but you still have to get the permitting and the lot and the development approved and done. Like, even the fastest kind of home takes months to put a family in there. So there's just no way that inventory is going to turn around that quickly, even in an environment where we might have a healthy supply chain, and we don't. So builders, even if builders had all the supplies they needed and access to those supplies, they can't turn a house around in a week. It takes a long time to do that, and they don't even have access to the supplies to the quantity of supplies that they need in order to do this. So inventory is not going to turn around anytime soon. So people will sometimes, there's two kinds of crashes that people are hypothetically waiting for, like rates to drop so that they can afford to buy something. We already talked about that being a bad idea. Like, you're better off buying now, and then when rates drop, refinance then, and receive all the equity that will happen when that happens and have the lower payment. Like if you knew rates were going to be lower a year from now, you would buy today if you really knew how that market worked. So
100%.
we talked about people waiting for that and that being generally a bad idea. The other thing people are waiting for is like, oh, real estate prices are just too high. That has to correct. No, it doesn't. It doesn't have to correct. The reason they're high is the same reason that apples and pears are high at the grocery store. It's been an inflation problem. Apple and pear prices aren't going to crash. What's going to happen is the feds are trying to curb the rate at which those things are increasing. They're not going to get them to go down. That's deflation. That's something they hate even worse than high inflation.
That's a disaster. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah,
All kinds of
that is
problems
something
come with
nobody
deflation.
wants. So they're going to try to curve that so it stops increasing so quickly. But once they capture that, they're going to, and we've seen this. They've started, they've talked about not raising rates, maybe even lowering rates because they're like, okay, inflation is under control. They're not trying to get it to go backward. They're just trying to get it to climb less quickly. So the price of a house isn't going to crumble because two things: there's no inventory. The feds don't want that to begin with, and they're the ones that control that lever. And the third reason is that it's a product that everybody needs, right? We're not talking about Slurpees. If Slurpees get really expensive, people just don't buy them because they don't need them. I haven't had a Slurpee in 30 years. I was trying to think of something whimsical and silly, right? But people aren't going to stop. I mean, it's as other than like food and water, the next thing on that Maslow's hierarchy of need is shelter. People aren't going to stop needing that. And you've got two ways that you can solve that problem. If you want to not sleep on the sidewalk, you can either pay somebody who has more than they need to borrow it from them every night or every month, rather, right? Because rent is usually paid on a monthly basis.
Yep.
You can either pay somebody that has more than they need and the value of what they own goes up and up and up, and you're paying for that so that you can not sleep on the sidewalk. And if that's your only option so that you don't sleep on the sidewalk, by all means do that. But you should be
Yes.
thinking about a permanent way to solve that problem for yourself because you're going to have that problem the rest of your life because you want to live indoors. If you can solve that problem permanently and coincidentally for a lot less money, because spending, the amount of money spent on rent over a lifetime is significantly more than the amount of money spent on owning a home. And I'm not just talking about the mortgage. There's the mortgage, but I'm also including taxes, insurance, maintenance. All that stuff is significantly less over time. Of course it is. Why would anybody invest in real estate if it costs more to provide it than you could sell it for, rent it for to a tenant?
Yeah.
It
If
always
you
works that
think
way.
you're avoiding, like you like to say, if you think you're avoiding the cost of a mortgage or the cost of home ownership by renting, I mean, it sounds kind of rhetorical and a little silly when you put it that way, but you're
Yeah.
wrong, right? Renting is paying for somebody's mortgage. And I know that's thrown a lot around as kind of a slogan in real estate and even a quip. And I don't know if that's even a great service to our clients because they think we're being snarky, maybe. But you're paying 100% interest when you pay rent, or you're just you're paying down someone else's mortgage. That is all true. But if we want to connect with our renting clients and our prospects and people who are aspiring to own homes, we need to put a little more eloquently, I think. And if we can do this with their own numbers, that really hits home for them. I did want to talk about one more thing around inventory and why it's so low and why it's not going to just all of a sudden jump. Do you know what a NIMBY is, Brady?
Mm-mm.
NIMBY, NIMBY, it stands for not in my backyard. So there are people who do not want housing built in their neighborhood because they were there first and they want to preserve their mountain views or their lake views or beach views, and they're going to go pretty aggressive in their city council saying, I don't want to have those multi units built. I don't want a duplex built. They may even protest, single family homes in there just because to preserve their small town feel. I think excuse me, I think that's a little short sighted because our population is always growing, and in red hot markets like Salt Lake City and Denver, where we are, it's tough to justify. Like I understand as a homeowner perspective, I probably wouldn't want a high rise apartment building in my backyard, but I also realize that population is growing. They got to live somewhere. I don't own the land where they're going to do that kind of stuff on. And I realize that I don't want. I would love housing costs to be affordable for first time home buyers and for people who need a place to live and are really struggling to pay their rent. I would love that to be affordable, but there's also a balance too in city planning, and that is an obstacle that a lot of builders are facing right now. So
Yeah, I've got nothing to add to that. I think you're absolutely correct. There's always going to be some resistance there. I just don't see, I don't, well, and that's what you're saying is true. And it's also true that just the more complex and first world a country becomes, the more regulations just get put into place. And so it just
Yeah.
takes longer. I don't know what it's like there in Salt Lake City, but I know in the Denver metro area, permits for multifamily got significantly more expensive recently, and it just takes longer
Yep.
to process that stuff. Inventory. So we're not just talking about the builders getting supplies and hammering the houses together and making them available for people. There's also a bureaucracy that they have to push that stuff through to get it approved. That takes a very long time. Inventory just for this type of product and service, it just takes a long time to put together, which is another. I mean, I don't think of myself as conspiratorial, but it's just been this odd coincidence of three articles, one in the New York Times and two in the Wall Street Journal, all in the same month, talking about how nice it is to rent a property, or how buying a home has never been harder. Maybe you're better off renting. And it's like, the people who run those publications, they own real estate, they own all sorts of things. They're very wealthy conglomerates of groups of wealthy people. I'm 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 not going to go so far as to say I think they're trying to sell something, but they certainly could have stopped that. They should know better, especially the Wall Street Journal. It seems like they're pushing the idea of renting, and you know who's going to benefit from that is the people who own real estate.
Definitely. And I'm interesting. So yeah, Fox and I want to look up. So Rupert Murdoch owns the Wall Street Journal, and he's a huge person in media. Obviously, he owns a lot. I think he owns Fox News and a handful of other ones out there. Big presence. So what he wants out there, I'm not making a judgment good or bad of what he does, but I haven't looked into this. I'm curious to do so if he has any ownership in firms like BlackRock or Blackstone, who are buying these single family homes and have a really real interest in getting more renters. I don't know what that is, and I haven't done my research on that, and I'm not likely to be one that's going to spout conspiracy theories, but definitely people who have big pockets, a lot of them own real estate, and they want you to rent, and they want you to stay renting for life.
Well, once you get
So,
wealthy enough, it's hard to not buy real estate, right? It's hard if you have to spend $1 billion. I mean, if you have if your net worth is $1 billion, you don't have $1 billion bank account, right? You own lots and lots of stuff, and the only thing that you can really own with that amount of money is businesses and real estate.
yeah. So,
I say only.
as a
There's probably some
CPA, I
other
understand the
ideas in there. Go ahead.
Yeah, and as a CPA, I understand the power of that. The Internal Revenue Code is so favorable to real estate ownership, even if it's your own home, but definitely for real estate investors. They heavily encourage and subsidize via the tax code real estate ownership and and owning rental properties and investment properties. That's hugely subsidized by the tax code. So they're not dumb for doing that. I don't blame them.
Yeah.
So,
Well, so I don't have a
anything
problem
else to
with
add?
people doing that. I just have a problem with that getting through the Wall Street Journal editing department saying,
Yeah.
"Hey, let's," and making it look like it's a reporting article talking about, "Hey, look at the rise in these statistics." That's how it was worded in the beginning, but you can tell if you read the article, it's very pro, "Oh, this is a really good deal for these people. Look at these people who have decided to rent and what a cool idea that is." It really sells the idea, and it's a tragedy. It's not
And
good.
I always look up the authors of these articles and see what else they've written. They're like, are you really a real estate expert, or do you cover the war in Afghanistan or Ukraine, or do you talk about other politics that have nothing to do with? And there's nothing wrong with that. Great writers are going to know how to write about a lot of things, but this kind of thing where this analysis and what it's so heavily weighted and has such a huge impact on day to day life, I think warrants a little more expertise. So.
I agree.
So I think that's going to be it for our podcast this week. Thanks for listening, and we hope you have an excellent rest of the year and an excellent new year.
Good chatting with you, Dan.
As always, see you later.